Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 926th New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Aimee Ng, Richard J. Powell, and Jason Rosenfeld. We are thrilled to welcome poet Jaye Elizabeth Elijah here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we're speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and hosts. Aimee Ng is a curator at the Frick Collection. In 2020, she co-curated Frick Madison, the critically acclaimed installation of the Frick's historic collection in the Breuer building, where she recently co-organized a year-long project called Living Histories, Queer Views and Old Masters. She's also worked on the Frick's video series, including the Webby Award-honored Cocktails with a Curator and What's Her Story? Richard J. Powell is the John Spencer Bassett Professor of Art and Art History at Duke University. He has written on a range of topics, including such titles as Cutting a Figure, Fashioning Black Portraiture, and Going There, Black Visual Satire. Powell has also organized numerous art exhibitions, most notably Back to Black, Art, Cinema, and the Racial Imaginary, and Archibald Motley, Jazz Age Modernist. From 2007 until 2010, Powell was editor-in-chief of the Art Bulletin. Powell is currently the Leonard A. Lauder Research Center Distinguished Scholar at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And our host today, Distinguished Chair and Professor of Art History at Marymount Manhattan College, Jason Rosenfeld, PhD, has curated the exhibitions John Everett Millay, Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian Avant-Garde, and River Crossings. He is co-author of the monograph Cecily Brown and a senior writer and editor-at-large here at the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you all so much for joining today, and I'll turn it over to you, Jason.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Welcome, everyone, to the 926th New Social Environment since March of 2020. That puts us only 276 away from Mike Krzyzewski's coaching record of victories, 1,202. So we're inching there slowly and slowly and slowly. We just passed Bob Huggins. I want to welcome Rick Powell from Duke and the Met, who's here with us today, and Aimee, who's here from the Frick. Thank you both so much for coming.
Thank you.
And we're all in New York, but we're all on Zoom, but we're going to be speaking to you today. Just a few thanks. Thanks, of course, to the Rail team, Carolyn, Chloe, Eleanor, and Fong. And thanks also to the exceptional team at the Frick, that is Heidi and Mitch and Alexis, who get the word out, get the stuff to you, and throw the best press previews possible. Also, shout out to Antoine Sargent, who can't be here today, but who was co-curator with Aimee of the show. Let me plug the catalog, which I noted in my review of the exhibit is indispensable. It's got amazing stuff in it. It's beautifully produced, and it even shows you sort of how he painted his pictures, because the figures are shiny and the backgrounds are matte. Incredible work. Awesome. And also, those of you who might not know, Rick was involved in the most amazing show Barkley Hendricks worked. This is the catalog from Birth of the Cool, which originated at the Nasher Art Museum at Duke University in 2008. Trevor curated it, and then it went to the Studio Museum in Harlem, where I saw it at least 5 times, and then it traveled all over the globe, really America, Santa Monica, Philadelphia at PAFA, and then Houston. Expensive online, this book, but a great book, and there's a terrific essay in it by Rick about Barkley L. Hendricks anew. So welcome, everyone, and let me jump right in with this screen share, and we will give you an introduction to what's going on Madison and what you can see there. Barkley Hendricks passed away in 2017, so it's been 6 years since he's been with us. And this is quite a showcase, I think, for his work. Here is the Breuer building on Madison, file photo with snow, when we used to have snow. On the left, building built 1964 to 1966. Interesting, because 66 is when Hendricks made his fateful trip to Europe, expanded his world. Of course, he would have experienced the Frick in the mansion on Fifth Avenue at that time. We can talk a little bit about that too. And on the right is one of my favorite of his self-portraits with his Simon Gratz High School 75 shirt on, Philadelphia Proud, and two of his paintings, self-portraits, one of which is in the exhibition, the picture on the right. Amy, why don't you just tell us a little bit about, maybe to start, how this show came about. And here's the view that you get when you exit the elevators and enter the fourth floor, right? The fourth floor at the Frick. And this is what you are confronted with this incredible juxtaposition of Hendricks in the center, and on the left and right, two Marmalian, marble busts by Houdon.
Thanks, Jason. And first of all, thanks for having us on the New Social Environment today. I should start by saying it's like a huge privilege to be working with the art of Barkley L. Hendricks. As you know, I'm an Italian Renaissance specialist, and I work in mostly really, really old things. And to come across the work of Barkley Hendricks, and it sort of came from a conversation I had with Antoine Sargent about the kinds of artists whose contemporary work could shed new light on the Frick's historic collection. Never could I have imagined an artist as perfectly suited to that task as Barkley, because he was both historic and novel. He both loved the Frick and turned a lot of the traditional elements of the historic art collection on their head to create something very innovative. So it really was moving into the Breuer building, as we're in this temporary space while we're renovating the mansion, that I was looking for the kind of right contemporary artist who could better shed new light on our historic collection in this sort of once in a lifetime opportunity to show, 500-year-old paintings in this contemporary modernist space. And Barkley not only it has been revelatory for his own corpus, people are getting to know him and his portraits better, but what's been really gratifying is that we have a lot of people who are new to the Frick coming and seeing his paintings and then discovering the rest of the Frick's collection. So this is Lottie Mama, Studio Museum, 1969. And the gold background here is actually gold leaf. He applied it himself after learning how to do this, a very difficult process after looking at Byzantine icons, early Italian Renaissance paintings. And we have people going then to the third floor of Frick Madison and looking at gold ground paintings from the 13th, 14th century, and just making that connection. Not everybody knows about Byzantine painting and early Italian painting, and it's an amazing way for people to get back into history through the door of Barkley Hendricks.
And, just looking at the view there on the right with this picture in juxtaposition with the historical collection, it really struck me. 1969, when Hendricks painted this, is the sort of tail end of the high points of the civil rights movement. And on the right, you have this marble bust from the Ancien Regime in France in the 18th century. And then to the right of that, this sort of typical rippling Sir Joshua Reynolds portrait, which is about the apex of the British Empire. And this extraordinary conversation that comes together in the galleries. And people will see when we go around the corner that the Hendricks works are all kind of self-contained in two rooms. But how is the decision made whether or not to integrate all of Barkley's works with the rest of the collection, or think about it in a different way?
Yeah, it was really important for me to acknowledge sightlines to historic works, but we wouldn't intersperse Rembrandt's paintings. If it was a monographic show, we wouldn't intersperse them throughout another collection. We'd give Rembrandt the dignity of his own galleries. So too would we treat Barkley with the dignity of his own spaces devoted with, like you've just outlined in this photo shows, important visual comparisons, like Lottie Mama coming right off. And then as we tour the exhibition, this is something that's special to the Frick Madison galleries. This would be a lot more difficult to do in the Frick mansion, allowing these reverberations of history to sort of frame views, but giving Barkley still his own space. Mm-hmm. And that Reynolds painting used to be the brightest thing in the room until Donald Formey and Blood came along.
Right, he sort of blows it out of the water, and it's a great, it kind of pulls you in to the show, and you're not sure what to expect, and then you see this incredibly sanguine-looking picture there on a kind of off angle, juxtaposed to the Reynolds, and then if she only knew what was around the corner, those are the kind of things that I think are quite fun. But then when you go in the room, you get to see these extraordinary Hendricks. So this is a view to orient people from the main room on the 4th floor, looking into the side room, which is filled with paintings which are all dominated by white backgrounds and white outfits. And then the main room that you're sitting in, that you're in here, has a real variety of different works that show the range of his style. Now, the show is limited to a certain chronological period. What was that decision?
Yeah, we were really
why was that decision made? Sorry.
Well, we were trying to get close to sort of this moment of Europe and the true, the innovation of that trip and his thinking about historic portraiture as something to innovate for his own moment. So we chose 14 paintings from this period, 1969, after he comes back from his trip. And the latest is 1983, which is the last portrait he paints in this period of his wife, Susan. And I think it was a really important coda to put on that moment. He went off to do other things. He didn't stop painting. He went to do landscape paintings, basketball paintings. But in terms of portraiture, he takes a hiatus after that picture for about 20 years. And it was a sort of a clean way to keep it a nice, tight look at this, decade or so of innovation after his return from Europe.
I want to ask you about that, Rick, because I know you went to Yale and you got an MA in Afro-American Studies in 1982, and then a MPhil in the History of Art in 1984, a PhD in 1988. And all this while, Barkley is painting in New London, Connecticut. He taught for the most of his career at Connecticut College in New London, which is about a little less than an hour north of Yale. And I know from your essay in Birth of the Cool that you went to see his show in 1978 in New York at the ACA galleries. So maybe talk a little bit about, what was the perception or the presence of Barkley and his work at Yale when you were there in the 80s, after he had already been there? And then, how did you kind of connect with him in the 70s and 80s, please?
Sure, Jason. Again, thank you for including me in this conversation. I'm just so delighted to be with you talking about one of my favorite artists. Yes, I saw a show that Barkley did, a solo exhibition at ACA in 1978, but I had known about Barkley for the longest. I did my MFA in printmaking at Howard University, and I remember talking to some of my fellow students, graduate students in the art program at Howard. And I think we were talking at one point about, well, maybe we should bring in some contemporary artists. And I remember at that point mentioning to them, although the idea fell flat, to bring in Barkley Hendricks, because I think we knew about him throughout the 1970s as this innovator, as someone interested in portraiture, interested in the Black body, but doing it in a way that was very, very different than what one might have seen in the galleries at Howard, for example. And so he's always been on my mind. And then when I met him, I guess my interest in him expanded, because he not only is an amazing artist, he was a delightful person to engage with. We were not close then. We would just engage with one another every once in a while on Madison Avenue when he did his show at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And then in that same time period, I'm in graduate school, I'm writing about other things, but I'm also attuned to what's happening, in the art world. And I distinctly remember in the 1990s, by the time I got my teaching gig at Duke, and I got the opportunity to write a book called Black Art, A Cultural History, that I wanted to include Barkley as part of the art history. He had not been included in all the other major books that had been done on African-American art. And I knew that if I wanted to tell a full story, I would need to acknowledge this amazing portraitist who's looking at old masters, who's also looking at the moment around him, the people around him, the clothes, the style, the dandies of the streets of Black America, and really finding ways of translating that, not doing it literally, but finding ways of both paying homage to them and but making really, really fine works of art.
So was he involved at all with the community at Yale? It's interesting to me because Aimee just mentioned that he took a 20-year hiatus from making portraiture. So does that mean that he kind of drifted a little bit off the scene while he was working in different areas, or was he just concentrating on teaching? It's an interesting period to me.
Well, he's painting this whole time. He's a very active artist up until the end of his life. But the 70s, I would tend to agree with Aimee that that's kind of a crescendo moment. It seems like one painting after another is just extraordinary. And the irony is that the material is limited in the sense of a sitter, or in this case, a poser, their clothing, a stark background, and yet he does so much with that. My sense is that, in the 1980s and really throughout his career, he's working, but there's nothing like that 70s moment. But this is also a moment, I'd say in general, that's actually quite rich in terms of African-American art. This is the moment that David Hammons kind of comes onto the scene. It's the moment of Linda Bryant's Just Above Midtown. It's a moment of great abstract artists like Jack Whitten and Sam Gilliam and William T. Williams. So there's really a lot happening. This is the beginning of conceptual art with a lot of people as well. And so Barkley is kind of doing his thing in the midst of this. And I really see him as part of a really, really interesting bigger picture. He's also taking photographs, which is what's so good about engaging with him in most recently posthumously. We're now seeing these photographs that really show us the kind of call and response between the photographic image and the painterly image.
Yeah, there was a terrific show at the Lyman Allen Art Museum up in New London this past summer of Hendricks's works in and around New London, and it had more and more of these photographs seem to keep coming out, and Jack Shaman shows as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Maybe walk us through, both of you, the way that he kind of constructed these high period pictures in the 1970s. These were all being done in studio, but they were product of an interesting kind of process.
Sure, I'll take. Go ahead, Rick. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I'm so glad you've juxtaposed the photograph of Donald Formey and the painting, because what we're able to see is the tools of photography and then the art of painting really taking the information that he's received and really moving it into a whole nother realm. I mean, when I look at the painting Blood, I know it doesn't sound like an immediate juxtaposition or a comparison, but I'm thinking of fashion photography of the 1960s and 70s, people like Richard Avedon and others who do these stark backgrounds, the rolled paper that gives you the seamless background, and then these beautiful figures kind of placed on those fields. But unlike Vogue, which is black and white mostly, Barkley just infuses these works with color, not just the colors of the people, but the colors of the background, their clothing. And so that becomes a kind of an added element to think about and to absorb. Aimee, I'll let you jump in. I know I'm going on.
That's all right, Rick. As you know, I only love listening to you speak. And it's with thanks to the Barkley Hendricks estate and Susan Hendricks that we were able to, and David Katzenstein, who works with the Photo Archive, that we were able to publish a good number of these sort of supportive or associated photographs in our catalog to go along with these paintings. And they do tell part of the story. It has been an enormous honor to be able to meet some of the sitters. And Susan Hendricks put me in touch with Donald Formey, who came in And, the photographs, I think, tell part of the story. He's captured there, he's not wearing those pants, things get changed, the blue button, that kind of thing. But when you hear from Donald, and there's some audio recording available on the Frick site and on the app when you experience the exhibition, where he tells, something that's not recorded is that it's not just the photographs, but Barkley's painting both from photographs as references, and he has the sitter come in and model from life when he can. And in doing so, and you'll see, the photograph on the left, he's just standing there in his jeans. On the right, he's holding a tambourine. Donald tells a story of music on in the studio. He always had music playing, and Donald was tapping his foot along with the beat. And Barkley stops him and says, "Oh, you seem pretty musical. Can I give you something to hold?" And that's when he gives him the tambourine. So it was really like an evolution in the act of painting during that sitting with the live person there, that something transforms in this painting. And I think that tambourine really gives not just a moment of composition and a focal point, but also a place to demonstrate enormous technical achievement. If you look very closely at the very careful way in a really old master oil painting style that Barkley's able to show off that tambourine. And one of the first things that Donald said when he was reunited with his painting in the Frick galleries a little while ago was, "I wasn't wearing that blue button." And the whole thing, it was a surprise to him that Barkley would invent something so, seemingly arbitrary, but he's a colorist. This is a color theory, something bouncing right off of that, plaid and red pattern and composition. This blue button it's like a shock.
Yeah.
I think it was Avedon who said a portrait is not a likeness. And so one is delightfully reminded as we look at these paintings that, and your narration, Amy, that the artistry of painting is very much a part of all of these works, that truth can be invoked in multiple ways, not just in terms of verisimilitude, but kind of capturing one's spirit, one's soul.
And in these details, I think you can see exactly what Amy's talking about. I mean, this lovingly rendered flannel jacket with matching pants, which, as you saw from the photograph, he added. And then these little punctums, the button, I called it curiously wordless because I couldn't figure out what it was at a period when, people were wearing buttons for all kinds of causes. And it reminds me of what Amy Sherrill does now, contemporary painter. She always includes like a little thing, like one earring, one wisp of hair, or something on the garment that draws your eye. Well, once you see it, you can't not see it, but you might not notice it right away. And she got that from Barkley, what he does in these pictures. So the button, and then the hands with these very long fingernails, and this one bracelet on his wrist. All these kinds of things which come together, the idea of showing the tambourine in perspective, which comes straight out of Renaissance painting, showing musical instruments in perspective to show your ability to paint in depth illusionistically. And of course, then he beats that all back with the red, this pulsating red, which just jumps out at you and grabs you. It's an extraordinary painting. And this is from a private collection, right? Yeah, from private.
I was thinking in the hands of another artist, they probably would have been scared to do a red background. But Barkley was kind of fearless with this painting, and decided that he wanted this heat, he wanted this energy to envelop this young man, and this suit that is beyond beyond everything. Right. And so he's really kind of adding flames to fire, or in this case, to really give us something quite, delightfully visually volatile.
Here's an Instagram post from yesterday by the savvy social media folk at Frick Madison, Frick Collection, with a photo of the sitter who came back to the gallery and posing in front of his own painting. I think the whole idea, which we think very differently about portraiture now, is that it's a collaboration between the painter and the subject. There's a show that's opening at the Delaware Art Museum this week on Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and a lot of writing about what he's been doing in his paintings and with his models, who are always treated as these sort of characterless women who he transformed into a new post-Venetian Renaissance idea of Victorian beauty, that actually they're collaborators in their own self-imaging. So how much of that do you see in Barkley's work?
Well, I wrote a book in the early 2000s called Cutting a Figure, Fashioning Black Portraiture. And one of the premises of that book is that in a long history of depictions of peoples of African descent, many of them subjugated peoples of African descent or ridiculed images of peoples of African descent. There are nonetheless moments and spots in the whole history of portraiture, Black portraiture, where we see some interesting things going on between the subject and ostensibly the portraitist. I think, I forget what the quote is, but for many portraits, we are not just seeing a portrait of the subject, we're actually also seeing something of the painter as a part of that a conversation. And we're also seeing, I would argue, a contract, a kind of an understanding that in this case, Formie kind of knows that he's in front of somebody who he has simpatico with, who understands him, who quote unquote digs the outfit that he has on. And as a result, we have this really, really wonderful relationship, this kind of tete-a-tete between the subject and Barkley. I mean, I'm so glad you showed those first pictures of him, because he was a colorful kind of dandified character himself. So in some ways, there's no surprise that all these images of these beautiful people were created, because in some ways, those are extensions of him.
Yeah, do you think it's different from, if going to your area, the Renaissance, Amy, the way that the relationship between subject and painter, the painter would be painting people from a aristocratic class, possibly, or royalty, and would be much lower down on the pole than the subjects. But here, there's such a respectful relationship. That's the thing that's always really struck me about these pictures. And the Frick show does not have any of the nudes in them, but it's there as well in all the paintings of these people, that he's showing them respect, and they're clearly responding to him. And of course, some of them he just pulled off the street, literally, or shot on the street, photographed on the street, and didn't know them at all beforehand.
I think one of the most important differences between, say, Renaissance portraiture and what we see in Barkley's portraiture is that the momentum comes from Barkley. So these are not commissions. No subject is asking Barkley for something that will please them, which is the total opposite case to what was happening in the Renaissance, where the artist worked for the patron, make something beautiful of me, show me at my best. Barkley is, I do think it's a collaboration, because he's seeing something in that person, their individuality, and celebrating something about that style. But they kind of leave it. They leave themselves, and they trust Barkley to do what he will. A lot of the sitters aren't watching him while he's painting and watching, the progress and making comments. They see it at the very end. He was very private about the way he was painting things. So in a sense, it's a little bit of an inversion, let's say, like who wants to do what. Barkley is seeking patrons out, in a sense, whereas the patrons in the Renaissance were seeking out artists for themselves.
Yeah. Here's a painting which you would have noticed in the last image, which is a knockout that I had never seen before. So we had the red on red in Donald Formie, and now this image of Woody from 1973, where he's, it looks even more radical, yellow on yellow background. This was the product of a number of photographs that were taken outside by Barkley of him dancing. So I encourage you to check out the catalog, everyone, because it has all this material in it. You won't see it in the show proper. And it's extraordinary. It's gold, yellow, marigold, whatever it is. It's amazing. Rick, what do you think about this one? It's a real outlier.
I'm also thinking that typically Barkley's portraits are oriented vertically, that they really subscribe to the height of the individual. And with Woody, he is really paying homage to this incredible dancer, and this feat of standing on one foot and stretching out, all the appendages, but keeping this perfect kind of balance. And so it's an outlier in that respect, but actually looking at it and thinking about it in relationship to blood, we're seeing again Barkley as a painter, utilizing his license to think about color, to think about contrast, to isolate, and to create really, really powerful, evocative silhouettes. The famous silhouette conceptual artists of the 90s and early 2000s, Carol Walker, was doing these amazing cutouts, on walls. And one could argue that Barkley was conceptually silhouetting with so many of these works with these brown and bodies against lighter areas or contrastive arears. Again, I keep on coming back to him as a painter. This is somebody who is deeply invested in the art of painting, and one really kind of marvels at all of the strategies that he takes.
And you mentioned that he usually works in portrait mode, not landscape mode, unless he's doing group portraits, right? In which case he spreads them out. And this is definitely an outlier in that sense, but also I think in the sense that there's action in it, and there's very rarely action in Hendricks's portraits. I mean, sometimes like in the one of Tyrone, he's sort of posing in a way that implies a kind of action, but this is actual action. It was not what he went after in his work.
The other thing, though, Jason, I think makes it so unique and singular in a sense, is that there's no cropping of the figure. And all the other, let's say 13 of the other works in the show, and the vast majority of the portraits of this period have a very deliberate cut. Something is just cropped off, just, as a photographer, and I think he was a photographer first before anything else. The idea of framing, the idea of, fitting that figure within the confines of a frame. It's very rare that the frame actually contains the entire figure, and I think that's what gives a little bit of a difference and intensity to this particular painting.
Yeah, and Jason, you're correct that these are posing figures, and that there's stasis that seems to be a part of their corporeality. But I would counter that with saying that what makes these works so alive for me is that even in that stasis, even in those singular figures, we're looking at energy. We're looking at the energy of the clothes. We're looking at the undulations of features of the arms, the legs, the feet, the heads against a field. And in fact, one could argue that contrast creates a kind of an optical, motion and energy, from dark to light. And so these are works that to me are quite animated, despite the fact that they are quote unquote posed.
Yeah, it's like the difference between color field painting and action painting. That there's so much going on in the pictures, the colors, the poses, the sense of inner life, and the sense of just utter animation on their faces is what he gets so well. And here's, if people can see what Aimee's talking about, if you look at the source photographs that he used, sometimes he floats the people up to the top and crops their heads off. Sometimes he floats them to the bottom and crops their feet off. Here's another one at the top. So he is like moving them around up and down the canvas. And this is a little bit different in that respect. Here's what it looks like with actual people in the room. But I wanted to point out this picture on the end and maybe ask Rick a little bit about it, because this one is in the collection at the Nasher at Duke University. Bosser, Robert Bowen's 1975. This painting has an almost unphotographable light green background, and the picture on the right, which is supplied by the Frick, kind of gets it, but you have to see it in person. It's a work of alchemy.
Yes, and I'm showing my age. In 1975, I might have had a similar coat, pants kind of flaring at the ankles like that, and I've always worn a beard, so this is kind of bringing me back to myself, and it's really a tour de force work. As Aimee knows, in the Renaissance and in the Baroque period, the great painters would often do these portraits of people in various and sundry poses, all within one canvas. And it was to give a kind of a sense of their multiplicity of personality, their ubiquitousness. And Barkley here shows this gentleman in these poses, contemplative, posing, in conversation with himself. I mean, talk about a work that really kind of probes, kind of the subconscious and self-analysis, which is always a part of us as human beings, and yet he's putting it right there on canvas. But you're right, Jason, the colors in this are so right on. I'm sorry to use a 70s term.
No, bring it out.
But when we think about the blue, coat, which is a kind of a strange kind of light blue coat, and then these pants, which are just, I can't even name the color. They look like they might be, kind of off-white, but then they've got these kind of undertones in them. But then to top that off with this background, which is, I just don't know what the color would be called. But Barkley, as I said, works his palette, thinks about the compositions, thinks about that silhouette that you're going to get particular energies when you go to the edges of that hat and the nose and the beard and the Adam's apple with Basir. So it's just really a fine work. I was so delighted that the Nasher acquired it, because it's one that I remember originally seeing in his studio before they acquired it in New London. And so Trevor Schoonmaker, the director, was just had brilliant foresight in saying this needed to be in a museum.
Yeah, Amy writes really interestingly about it in the catalog with respect to images of the three graces and traditions in art that he's sort of accessing here, and like Van Dyck's triple portrait of Charles I, these kinds of things, some of which were preparatory for sculptures. But here, my favorite part is the figure off to the right, who's a little separated and then just looking out into the distance. There's very often, we'll see this with the lozenge-shaped painting in a minute, there's very often a sense of moving beyond in these pictures. They expand beyond the frame, but it's also, for me, it feels like these are celebrations of possibility. And that's what I get from a lot of these paintings. Maybe that's part of that collaboration we've been talking about.
And just on a very technical note, one of my favorite things about this painting is this sort of very subtle overlapping of the figure against himself on the left.
Yeah.
Where you have three versions of the same person, and yet two of them are sort of illusionistically overlapping each other in space. Is it again a sort of heightened energy right in those little details.
Anyone who hasn't been in the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke University should get down there. Trevor Schoonmaker has been collecting brilliantly, and the museum is a vital part of the Duke campus. When I was there in the 1980s, it was just like a floor in a room in a building on East Campus, and now it's this spectacular Vignoli building with an amazing collection and a great series of exhibitions. And it's one of the few university art museums that actually originates shows that go to other places. The Whitney, the Studio Museum, et cetera. That is atypical of university museums. There's my little plug. A couple more views from the main room, and we'll talk about this in a minute. This view where you get two portraits flanking a room full of paintings by James McNeill Whistler. Here's a view in the smaller side room with all these paintings, which are kind of white on white. Black sitters, of course, which make for a really striking display. It's a brilliant move to have these all together in this one room. Here's another view looking back out at Basir, which we just looked at, and these two really swaggering portraits on the left and right. One is a self-portrait on the left, and the other, I'm going to look at in more detail. That's this one that you see here, which is from the Whitney. It's called Steve. And again, this sort of white on white with these extraordinary clothes, and then the contrast with the shoes, and then the toothpick in the mouth, and then the amazing reflection on the glasses. Maybe explain this a little bit to people if you two don't mind.
And just to say, it's there are two self-portraits in this little room. There is Slick on the left from the Krauss Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, and here in Steve in the court. And the reflection of the glasses in Steve, which if you look at the photographs, those are not the glasses that the subject had on, that they've been swapped out. And those are the windows of Barkley's studio on State Street in New London. And in the far right corner, there's a little head with a gold band of a sunglass. And that is a self-portrait of the artist, you know, a la Jan van Eyck, a la Velázquez, inserting the image of the artist as he brings the subject to life.
Again, I'm just thinking of the moment in which these were created, a moment when there were very few major museums around the United States featuring works by African-American artists or featuring works that included African-American subjects. And my recollection is that this was in a show in the mid-70s, clearly after it was created. And one of the reviewers of the New York Times, who was not really known for being an advocate for shows that might explore, you know, Black identity, saw this painting and he was blown away. He said that this was absolutely stunning. So Barkley had that capacity to kind of pull people, you know, over to really rethinking their preconceived notions of what was appropriate in the museum, what kinds of subjects were worthy subjects, and I think he did that through his real mastery of paint.
And they are, I mean, all of them are paintings that reward both distant viewing, and you get this giant visual impact when you look at these paintings from across the gallery. You know, you get the chroma, you get the silhouetting, you get sort of even an abstraction, almost minimalist, that kind of thing. But they also reward very differently when you look at them up close. And so they have the sort of multiplicity of engagement. And I think they do operate on so many different levels in the sense that they can be experienced very differently, which is not, you know, totally new. Also in the Renaissance, there was the idea of distant viewing and close viewing, but not a lot of people in the 1970s in America were doing that.
And this is a kind of a quote unquote gimmick painting where you have a Black body in a white coat in a white background. But it works because I think that Barkley is also not just showing his skills as an artist, but he's also making a kind of a political statement of the times that peoples of African descent should be a part of a larger kind of world of beauty and discernment. And, you know, he's kind of really throwing it in the face of those people who had no notion that was even conceivable with a work like Steve.
And a couple notes about the process. It's a little hard to see, but he would paint the backgrounds with acrylics, which were fast drying and very matte. And then the bodies and the clothing, the figures would be done with oils and with varnish so that they're quite shiny. And that helps them to sort of pop off of the background a bit. And some of these, if the canvas was high, he would stand on something to paint the top of it. And he also often used projection to get the image onto the canvas. So, you know, he developed his own sort of scheme. It's a bit like Barnett Newman or Morris Louis or anyone sort of tinkering around with different kinds of paints to get the surfaces that they wanted. He's doing exactly the same thing, but in the field of portraiture. This is my favorite, I think, in the show. Omar with 2 R's that's not a typo, from 1981, which is a lozenge-shaped picture. And there are a number of paintings that he does from the back. There was one memorable female nude from the back in the LGDR show this past summer, Rear View. But here you see this figure from the back, and you see him in this lozenge shape, wearing this extraordinary puffy coat. And then I put in this detail at the back of his head where you can see he's wearing actually 2 pair of glasses, one of which is a little cockeyed off his head. He has the back of an earring visible there on his left ear. That's again that little detail that once you notice, you see it all the time. And I get the feeling he's just sort of floating off, up and away from you into the distance. A remarkable picture.
Thank you for this detail, Jason, because what it's also making me think is that there's a long tradition, particularly starting in the late 60s, moving into the 1970s, of photorealism, of artists who are utilizing the camera, are working really hard to replicate the kind of specificities and details that one might get from a camera image. And yet when we look at a work like this, we can see that Barkley has even taken that idea to a whole nother level. And part of taking it to another level has to do with the subject, has to do with the particular angle that he captures, and then has to do with these incredible details and also the things that he doesn't put in the picture. In other words, these are works that have economy, and part of that economy really allows that which is there to just pop.
Looking at, go ahead,
sorry,
Amy, sorry.
Just to say, also the idea of multiplicity as well in this one, it allows people to engage with the back-turned figure on so many different levels.
Yeah.
One who is historically minded might think of Caspar David Friedrich and the Rücken figure. Even Kehinde Wiley did a riff on that, mountain overlooking painting a couple of years ago. It's still sort of on the mind of people as this trope in historic painting where the viewer can imagine themselves in the place of that back-turned figure, and looking into the expanse of whatever they're looking at here, that's expanse of white. But also in the 70s, early 80s, turning one's back is also, it has a different kind of connotation in America. It's about protest, it's about refusal to comply, that kind of thing. And so I think the opportunities to read what one will in these pictures without any prescription of it's one or the other or either. It need not be any of these, but they engage so many moments of history.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful point about the Rücken figure, that you can insert yourself into the body of this figure and experience what they're experiencing, but there's not a view of mountains, there's not a view of rivers, there's nothing. It's just this sort of void, and it's so bright, right? But he doesn't have his shades on. I love that about it. There's a sense of humor in it. But the first thing that I thought of when I saw it was series of works by Mondrian, high period 1930s lozenge paintings. This is the one at the Guggenheim, using white and black lines, which are kind of the pinnacle of his, social idea of utopia. And these pictures, which are meant to connect with all people from all different backgrounds and kind of unify a society riven by war. I remember the MoMA massive Mondrian show, and it was incredibly moving when you got to these works and you understood what he was trying to do, what he was trying to develop, a new kind of language for a broad audience, or in fact, you might say a new audience. And, I feel very strongly that that's what Barkley's up to. It worked.
I just have to throw in there, in terms of art and anonymity, figures like Lorna Simpson, who starting in the early 90s has her subjects turning their backs. And of course, the ultimate back turner is Miles Davis. I went to a concert and he was notorious for turning his back on his audiences. So there's a little bit of cultural background to something like this as well.
That's great. So we're getting close to the end, but let's talk a little bit about the old masters and Mr. Hendricks. Here's a couple chestnuts from the Frick, two of my favorites, which, I don't know, Amy, but this is your realm. I think that these things, that Barkley's works sort of sing so beautifully in this space, and it's because you are able to sort of flit through all these traditions and see both the continuities and the ruptures that he's after.
And I think it's really important to point out that his admiration for these historic paintings came complexly, right? He both admired them as technical artists. He also saw what's missing in terms of representation. And he was very firm, and he recounts this is in the Birth of the Cool catalog, that he couldn't copy. It couldn't be an outright copy. This was not a passive imbibing of the lessons of history, but it always had to be, quote unquote, Barkley Hendricks style. Yeah. He would take formats, he would take materials, he would take handlings, a portrait by Moroni in the Uffizi Gallery. Nobody knows who Moroni is, but for some reason, thank you very much, good cue. For some reason, there's something that just singularly stood out to Barkley in front of the painting on the left, which is at the Uffizi, this black-clad figure, almost like the way he can find somebody on the street that singularly stands out for him for some reason. And when he thought about the kind of figuration and illusion of a figure against a background that Moroni accomplished here on the left, that's something that he imported and transposed onto a 1969 painting called Miss T that is both a 400-year-old fusion of figuration using the silhouette and the most simple of contours, and, as to quote Rick Powell, 1969 personified. So it can be both.
Yeah, depending on the left. Let's go back to that Moroni. But by the way, we didn't plan any of this. Amy has no idea what images are coming, but you know, we're just on the same page, literally. The Moroni's a fantastic artist. Those of us who trade in the realm of you know, figurative painting in the 19th century and realist stuff, very much aware of his work, because it seems, you know, so atypical for the 16th century. How did he get this kind of acuity of vision with the kind of mixture of these strange backgrounds and monochromatic backgrounds, these kinds of things? Here's the one at the Met on the right, and the one from the Uffizi. I love the fact that Hendricks would go to Europe and he would be turned on by not the usual suspects, although he was obviously, but also, you know, be fired up by this picture on the left, which, yeah, is not one of the top works in the collection. And now the Frick has a Moroni you bought not so long ago.
Oh no, we
right?
didn't buy it. This is the strangest cosmic thing.
Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. Go ahead, explain.
It was, you know, doing research on the show about 2 years ago and realizing how important Moroni was to Barkley just as a person. And that was a surprise to some of us. You know, fine, Caravaggio, okay, fine, Rembrandt, but Moroni just seems a little bit out there. And over the course of working on the show, we were gifted probably the last great Moroni in private hands. So that
better.
So it really was, you know, thank you, Barkley. Whatever cosmic things happen there.
Oh, fantastic. So and that's on view, right? The Moroni's on view.
It sure is, on the 3rd floor. Yeah.
I think it's also worth mentioning that looking at all these wonderful old master paintings, that all of these artists are working from a template where they have white or fair-skinned bodies against dark backgrounds. And this was kind of de rigueur in the literature of painting and portraiture, that you would always have that contrast. And so Barkley is flipping that lesson or that scenario with works like Miss T and his own portrait, where, you know, Black bodies, you know, become the focal point via stark light backgrounds. But he doesn't stop there. I mean, for me, what's so powerful about these, and this goes all the way back to some of the earlier images that we were looking at by him, that the browns in these faces and necks and shoulders and chests are so beautifully rendered. And he's really, you know, working at great length to really come out with highlights and shadows. And so he's really kind of using that brown in a way that when we think about Western art, you know, we usually get a blotch, a la, you know, I'm sorry, Manet, but the lady is a blotch, you know, next to the concubine. Whereas in Barkley's works, you know, Black people have specificities, have cheekbones, have eyes, have, you know, raised eyebrows, have lips with shapes and forms to them. I mean, he's really, you know, paying homage to Black corporeality like it had never been paid homage to.
And there's a part in the essay that I've written for our exhibition catalog in which I talk about sort of what kind of historic images and portraits of Black figures were available in the world. And very few of them, in fact, were around and in public collections before 1970. The most famous, of course, being the Wanda Pareja portrait by Velázquez that entered into the Met, a record price, 1970. But there wasn't much. And there are now a number of works in public collections that one can see, but some of those came in, you know, really in the 21st century. I will point to the work of Joshua Reynolds, who's a very, you know, a complicated painter, probably the most prolific painter of the 18th century in Britain. But there are a few illustrations in the catalog where Reynolds does kind of give the smallest hint that he's interested in the painting of darker skin tones than his usual powdered white ladies. And I did a little bit of research into whether or not a particular painting of a Black figure that Reynolds did and had his students copy was available at the Tate when Barkley went in 1966. I couldn't confirm that he saw it, but it would be interesting to even imagine Barkley encountering a historic artist engaging in the complexity of tones of the skin color called Black.
Yeah. So my favorite vista in the show is this one, where you see Miss T on the left from Philadelphia in 1969, we've been talking about, and then Ma Petite Kumquat on 1983, which Amy mentioned before, the latest picture in the show. It's a portrait of Barkley's wife, Susan, with all kinds of interesting accessories. And then the view into the next room where you have portraits by James McNeill Whistler, considered American, but really a European artist who worked in France and then had his efflorescence in England. Miss T on the left is a painting that's kind of pretty important to me. When I was growing up in high school in Philadelphia and becoming an art historian, I used to go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art all the time. That was my touchstone. And I used to see it every time. It was always up, but it was always in the hallway that led to the bathrooms and the cafeteria and the gift shop. It wasn't with the main collection. And, this was in the 80s. This is when the most important celebrity in Philadelphia was Julius Erving. And when they had just elected a Black mayor for the first time, Wilson Goode, and it struck us and my friends as kind of strange, I guess, to a degree. It was visible, but it wasn't integrated, right? And I think one of the great triumphs of this show is this integration and making these conversations and not showing Hendricks as, a kind of outlier, strange, but in fact, as part of the stream, and as someone who made the stream diverge in a very different direction, and has had a ridiculous influence on contemporary art. I mean, off the charts influence on contemporary art. And it was interesting to me as a Victorianist to kind of see these works in tandem, because the Whistler painting on the right, which is, I think, his greatest portrait in the US at least, and with the unfortunate title Flesh in the title, which is part of the story, right? Against Miss T and this idea of interesting backgrounds, modulated tones, figures who have a sense of inner life. All of that is here in these pictures, and in these sort of juxtapositions, although he's not after the same kind of decorative in a sense.
So Jason, I love this juxtaposition, but I kind of wish you had put Sargent's Madam X beside Miss T.
I have a sergeant coming, Rick. Don't worry.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But not Madam X. But yeah, you're right. That's
well, but only because particularly, let's just start with the titles. I mean, Sargent's painting is this anonymous woman. Now we know her whole story of kind of a grande dame from New Orleans who's turned Paris upside down. And Barkley decides to kind of do his anonymé, woman, and his girlfriend Robin Tyler, but also exploring back to your wonderful Mondrian juxtaposition and reflections on black and white, just what we can do with that, and again Brown becoming this kind of intermediary color to kind of give us details, information, and the like. I mentioned this before, but when I think of Miss T, I also think of kind of the heightened Black consciousness of the late 60s, early 70s, not just with hair, but with a kind of a pride and a kind of an activism. So that when one sees, this beautiful afro, one also thinks of a raised fist. One thinks about, again, activism. And again, I'm back to this idea of stasis, but at the same time, this is a work roiling with energy and subtle references, the chains around her hips, Again, when you
Yeah.
see these paintings in person, you're just blown away by all these beautiful details that really show that that they're not just flat, kind of works. They're works that draw you in.
And certainly, like in the wake of the Mexico Olympics, right? And Tommy Smith, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the other athlete's name.
Carlos.
Right, John Carlos, and the raised fist. I mean, it makes absolute sense. I think that's what is really so striking about it. But as you've been talking about, both of you, at the same time, he's so meticulous with the patination of her flesh, a very different symphony in flesh in this picture, and also so it's so important to him to give her a sense of that kind of inner focus, inner life mentality.
Jason, you said, it is unfortunately titled Flesh, Color, and Paint, but I think it really does bring to light the importance of what Whistler's doing. He's thinking of flesh color in his moment as a particular single hue paint, almost that you could put it into a tube. And it's an important point of conversation for me, especially when I have younger students coming in and we're talking about flesh color in these galleries, not just with Barkley, but even with Whistler alone. You can still today buy a tube of paint called flesh tone.
Right.
What color is it?
They used to have crayons that were flesh when I was a kid.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's important to keep these kinds of things, as part of the historical record. So here are a couple more art historical juxtapositions that I think are interesting. I'm interested in his what he might have thought about Victorian art, because the Victorians were introducing new colors. The Victorians were going for sort of more radical schemes. They, unlike the clotted and muddy Manets, and you can see them at the Met right now, his late portraits, which are not always that successful. These paintings like Sargent, where he's like Whistler, riffing off a particular color. Dr. Putzi at home, just thinking about this with respect to Blood and Donald Formey. And also I was thinking about Thomas Eakins, and the Philadelphia, I'm from Philadelphia, the Philadelphia connection feels really strong. Obviously Barkley Hendricks was from Philadelphia, and I don't know that much about his relationship with Eakins and Eakins's legacy. Of course, Hendricks was at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He would have been aware of his work. I don't see, well, anyway, Rick, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, Eakins is an extraordinary painter. And for that fact alone, I can't imagine Barkley not, checking these works out and thinking about what it is that Eakins is capable of doing. One doesn't, come from that city without, as an artist, not pay homage to these works. As you know, Thomas Eakins was not universally appreciated in the world of portraiture. People would have much preferred a Whistler or a Sargent portrait to an Eakins portrait, because Eakins was flinching in his renderings of people, also showing a kind of a deep psychology and depth of being that people were really very uncomfortable with. And I guess that I would imagine that Barkley picked up on that. And while there may not be kind of visual connections, I think that conceptually there's this thing about Eakins's depth that I think he's able to successfully address especially in a work like Miss T.
And do you think that also, Eakins was an uncompromising teacher, and you knew Hendricks. How do you think about his approach to teaching and his dedication to that aspect of his profession?
Well, I have heard accounts of Barkley, not so much teaching, but doing crits, where he is pretty tough. He really asks questions of his fellow artists, and they need to be ready to articulate or explain or be ready to kind of defend kind of their place in there as practitioners. And on the other hand, I think Barkley also appreciated people's independence to do what they wanted to do and to be what they wanted to be as visual artists. Amy, I think I heard you, make some sounds like you were going to say something.
That's right. I was making some whimpers, but just to interject.
Sorry.
With the comparisons with Sargent and Akins and Whistler, what becomes even more, I think, apparent with this kind of comparison is the idea of space and the idea of Barkley removing his subjects from the earth, from the earthly dwellings that they are photographed in or where they're standing. Especially when you see the photographs, especially when they're these vibrant backgrounds, they're urban, they're interesting, and yet he has totally transported them to an otherworldly space, a totally unfamiliar place that can be anything in a way. And I think that really comes out looking at the 19th century pictures, where even if you're flattening the background, the shadows give a lot away. You don't find the shadows in Barkley.
Yeah. And what did you call, Rick? Imaginary realism? Is that the term that you like to use?
I don't know what I said. I just said
I was trying to find it in your essay, and I can't find it right now. But
looking at Dr. Pozzi and also knowing something about Sargent, I would also say that Barkley, in the 1970s, is one of the few portraitists who does portraits of gay men. Yeah. And does them with their beauty and their style and their élan. And that way, I guess he does have something in common with Sargent in particular, being willing and able to kind of go beyond the kinds of representations of masculinity and femininity that most artists adhere to.
And also, I think, and I don't want this to just be a surface comparison. I don't think we're talking about it that way. But, the way that Sargent also was sensitive to his many Jewish sitters and made them into these images, the Wertheimers, of them as they saw themselves, instead of as people saw them. I feel like that's something a little bit what Amy's hinting about when she kind of had a positive reaction to Reynolds's images of sitters who have a kind of authenticity and a sort of innate character, which is not just culturally determined, right? And that's what Akins also does. And, Hendricks is inventing a whole new genre. He really is in this period. That's the extraordinary thing about what he's doing. Let me just move to this picture, and I want to just ask Rick, tell us what you're up to right now. You're a fellow at the Met, and what are you working on and related to pictures like this?
Sure. Before I get into that, I'll just explain what we're looking at. And again, thanks to Susan Hendricks, she explained the title to me. Brown sugar vine is, vine was a term that was used in the 60s in particular for really, really beautiful, snazzy clothes. And Susan said that Barkley's girlfriend at the time used to name him or refer to him as brown sugar. And so this is an instance of one's sartorialness being expressed not so much with all sorts of fancy clothing, but the absence of clothing. And yet that also is a form of vine or vines. So hence the image. Actually, when I look at this image, I think of Thelonious Monk and all his wild hats that he used to wear as he was playing piano. And here we get that. And we also get some incredible reflections from the sunglasses. But what I'm working on now is a book called Color Struck: Painting, Pigment, Affect. And it's from a series of lectures that I did in 2022, the spring of 2022, at the National Gallery of Art. And my premise is that both the medium of paint and the genre of painting employ or explore notions and concepts of pigmentation or pigment and color. And as a result, the works, not all works, but some works find a way of really kind of jolting us and discombobulating us, a la Brown Sugar Vine. I mean, this was a painting when it was shown in 1970. People did not know what to make of it. I think it was one of those paintings that got shown a couple of times. I think it was in a major show in Philadelphia, and then it was shown at the Whitney in a very special exhibit on Black art. But then I think it basically disappeared for a number of years until Trevor found it and included it in Birth of the Cool. But in this book, I'm dealing with colors as well as artists. And so there was no way I could talk about the color brown without acknowledging Barkley Hendricks's paintings and the ways that he uses this color, which some people consider not a color. Other people consider it almost elemental. And so that's why this painting, I think, is so important.
Excellent. The book will be great. This is product of the Mellon Lectures, the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And just to note that this is, of course, a self-portrait, and it's not in the exhibition, but it forms part of what Rick is working on now, book number 852, or wherever you are at this point.
No.
Just to show people who are not familiar with Hendricks's work, to wrap up today, the other things that he was engaged in, the other kinds of art he was making, and which you will see in various and wonderful shows at Jack Shainman Gallery, who represent the estate in sequence. I mean, every year or so. He did a number of these amazing basketball-themed paintings. The Rail buddy Terry Myers has written an essay about this in a book. And these pictures, which were a couple years ago, we had them down in Chelsea, where sometimes he plays with the canvas, pops it out a little bit, Tondi, although the Renaissance again. Some are like Warhol-like layouts of designs, these kinds of things. Really inventive, really interesting pictures, which maybe people are not that familiar with. Do you want to comment on this for a second? Either of you?
These are just wonderful, and they're amazing, and they're really, really important. And I don't know of any artist of that period who sees the way that Barkley sees, that takes something as quotidian and everyday as basketball, the backboard, the balls, just all of the elements of it, and he makes them into really, really provocative, thought-provoking works. I've talked about these pieces in some of the writings that I've done, and I've compared them to Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, where for Barkley, the proportions, the shapes that define our universe are the shapes that we find on the basketball court. These incredible geometries back to Mondrian, Jason, but in this case, a kind of designs that really bring us to the streets, that bring us to those everyday young men playing, pickup games, but pickup games that really do speak to a kind of proportionality and space and achievements that dreams are made of.
And I'll just interject to say that these are paintings that Barkley was making at the same time that he was making some of the great 1970 portraits that we have in the show. And the idea of those two things happening at the same time, the same creative juices going into various different outputs, and not to kick a dead horse in the sense of old master interest, but if you look closely at some of these basketball paintings, it's not just the geometry and Leonardo da Vinci, but also sort of Dutch still life painting, the sort of really quietly observed the rims and the balls, and just that kind of observational technical skill.
Yeah, I mean, the body was never far from his mind, no matter what he was doing. Two wonderful works which were in the show at the Lyman Allen this summer. Amazing plum, a la Charles Demuth watercolors here on the right. Mutant plum watercolor. He did some very beautiful watercolors, some of industrial landscapes, interesting things. And then on the left, this is one of a series of lots and lots of plein air paintings that he would make, I believe, in a single day, right? In Jamaica, when he would visit Jamaica.
Yes. Again, this picture in particular on the left, really shows him as a composer, as someone who's really thinking about not just the real world, but how he can manipulate and reimagine that real world and make it into something that is imagined, that is invented, that is poetic, and that really speaks to kind of the power of an artists to design and to implement. A lot of these paintings in Jamaica have this oval, this image that almost reminds you of a portal. You know, that also it's a very Baroque shape, I think. Am I correct, Amy?
And the shape of the eye, as well.
These images really, you know, again, are in wonderful conversation with the past and the present. Again, the location, though, is the Caribbean, and that speaks volumes too.
And finally, the most revelatory things I think I've seen recently are the photographs, which just keep coming out. And Susan says there are thousands they're going through. This fabulous one, Untitled, 1985. He took many, many pictures of himself taking pictures, not just self-portraits, but with the actual apparatus revealed. And here in a sort of surveillance mirror in a shop on the left. And then there's a whole series of works that are reflective of the Confederacy, the Klan also in Connecticut in the 1980s, which are deeply disturbing, and the stories about them are fascinating. And he went to a Klan rally and photographed as well. So I encourage people to check those out. And then I'm going to turn it over to questions in a second. The last show at Jack Shaman was this past summer. Barkley, L. Hendricks, myself, When I Am Real. And it had this suite of 3 photos. They're all the same size, but I had to fit them into the screen, of him in a bathrobe in maybe presumably his bedroom, because the books are all art books and you can read all the spine titles, and with a lover model posing here with him. And it is one of the most extraordinary set of pictures, which, you know, we should be talking about it in terms of Manet and Kirchner and Matisse and whoever else in these images. And of course, in an environment which is entirely red, just thinking about the painting Blood, which we've been talking about. I think these are astounding. And Velasquez, and just name them. This fits into that whole concept, but also including himself. And this little detail where he's taken down the camera so you can see his face. I mean, I never knew him, but I feel like he's one of the few artists that you feel like you know when you see his work. I don't know how else to describe it. Maybe Rick, you can end, and Amy, and
well, just you know, looking at this picture, and I was thinking about is it Matisse's bedroom?
Carmelina in Boston, maybe, or the Odalisques.
I mean, this just like kind of again underscores how incredibly visual and artist with a capital A Barkley was. And I just feel very lucky and blessed to have known him and to have engaged with his work as I have.
And Amy, when do you move back to the mansion? Maybe
we close Frick Madison on March 3rd, and we have the Barkley Hendricks show up until the 7th of January. So the catalog has gone into a second printing already. They're flying off the shelf. So it's been a wonderful experience of our collection in the Breuer building. And I think hosting and having Barkley among us and among our paintings and sculptures and decorative arts objects has enriched our collection historically for the rest of its time.
Yeah, well said. Thank you both so much. For me personally, I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn and Chloe and the team to field some questions, but I really appreciate you both agreeing to come on, and such a stimulating conversation. And everyone get there by January 7th to see the show. Don't miss it.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for this conversation today. So yes, we have a couple audience questions here. I'm going to turn it to Chloe to ask one first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard, Amy, and Jason, for that incredibly luminous dialogue. I enjoyed every second of it, and I've enjoyed seeing the show twice now, and I can't wait to go back again and see it once more. Tabitha Soren has a question for you that I'm going to ask on their behalf. What prompted the transition from photography to painting for Barkley L. Hendricks?
Rick, I'm going to let you answer this, but I don't think it's necessarily a transition. I do think that they're happening side by side, but please.
That's what I was going to say, that when he emerges in Philadelphia as an artist, he is availing himself of all the tools that are available for making art. And that includes the camera, that includes paint, that's drawing. And so I don't think it's a question of transitioning from one to the other, although perhaps there are moments where one medium has a way of asserting itself at any particular moment. But that's the case with so many artists, where they really get into a zone with their camera or get into a zone with their paints. But I think in Barkley's case, it's not an evolution as much as it is movements back and forth and using the tools that will allow him to do incredible images at that moment.
Did he exhibit his photographs, Rick? Sorry, Amy. Did he exhibit them to any
I'm
great
not
degree?
aware of earlier shows of the photographs. I think at Lyman Allen in New London, they in the 80s there might have been some shows of the photography, but he was known for very many years as a painter first and foremost.
Thank you so much for those responses. That's really interesting that they were kind of in dialogue. And thank you, Tabitha, for that question. I'm going to pass the mic back over to my brilliant colleague, Carolyn.
Thanks. Thank you, Chloe. And let's see, our final question today is actually going to come from our very own Fong. So Fong, I think if you're there, oh yeah, I see you. Sorry, here you are. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Wow. You're such brilliant and energetic speakers. It's just amazing. What a pleasure to listen to you all three of you guys, really. Thank you so much. And reference in Philadelphia, that's when my family came as boat people in 1980, ended up in Bucks County, and then went to college also at University of Arts. And it's interesting, reference to Philadelphia, also Jason knows where he came from also. So we have that niche. The Sixers, right, Jason? 1983. Yep. And the Phillies, same year, 83. That's right. Pete Rose, Joe Morgan, Bo Diaz, Dr. J. Yes, indeed. Maurice Chicks, Bobby Jones. Anyway, when I was in art school, Richard and Amy, I remember sitting in the class at Sidney Woodman. The reason why I'm referencing this is so interesting, knowing that, you know, Barkley's from there. Just before the pandemic, I have this long interview with the David Lynch, you know, because he went to school there, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And we talk about his 2-3 years there, particularly study with not just Sidney Woodman, but also Hobson Pittman. And then there's Japanese-born American painter who I got to know, also Ben Kamihira. You know, there's other people in that whole community who was trying to inject figuration with art, you know, allegory, you know, but put in the context of urban and suburban environment. They often painted with such moody, kind of dark, often ominous lighting, you know, and look at Barkley's painting. They are the opposite. They're bright, they're iconic, and the word icon is to be reminded, worthy to be venerated, you know, worthy to be admired. I mean, he's spot right on. I mean, it's so much Italo-Byzantine aura in the work, especially when you walk in with that gold leaf that you described earlier, Amy, you know, that I couldn't help but think of Duccio and before him, Cimabue for sure, you know, but thinking about all of that, how I was also thinking about the issue of temperature. And I wanted to ask you guys about that, because temperature is the way that he constructed flat background, monochromatic, often tonal color, and that calibrate how the painted personality kind of be in that central axis, often. So I just wonder whether, in reference to that Philadelphia scene, Richard Aimee, moody, often allegorical and whatnot. And then with Barkley's work, it's often flat and it have a temperature of flatness, which is so uniquely his. So can you explore a little bit about that?
I would just add, Fong, that in addition to the artists that you described, I'm thinking about the music scene in Philadelphia has always been very, very rich. And at the moment that Barkley is coming of age, at the moment that he is doing those great basketball paintings and some of his early portraits, this is the moment where great jazz is being performed in the clubs. John Coltrane and company. And so I'm really thinking that when you talk about temperature and climate, that gets emanating, it emanates not only through chroma, but it emanates through a kind of an aural energy. And Barkley was quite devoted to jazz, and so it could very well be that world that he comes of age in and constantly goes back to it because his family is still there. Is a world that is informed not just by the visual, but by an incredibly rich music scene, which in itself heats up and energizes listeners and / spectators.
And I'll just add to that, to just go back into the visual world. He was I get the sense that he was a very empathetic painter, thinking of the viewers all the time. And I understand he would go hunt down these particular colors. And the way he would talk about, for example, Lottie Mama with the gold background, he wasn't expecting everyone to know history and Duccio and Cimabue, both of whom are represented in the Frick's collection. But also he thought, if you could see something shiny and gold and it could catch your eye, I hope that too would bring some value of this painting to you. So I do think that the colors that are, I think, also matched to the personalities of his subjects are also meant to, they're doing a favor to the viewer. He's got just a few seconds to catch their eye. And so he's trying to, give them something that they can delectate, that they can really get some visual experience out of that no one really was doing at the time in the same way.
Rick, what about not just jazz, but what about like Philly soul? I grew up in the 70s in Philadelphia soul music, Philly sound. I mean, because so much of his art reminds me of pop art, that there's a pop quality to it. And that I associate more with the kind of Philadelphia soul sound, which is much more popular music, right, than jazz.
I was listening to the Delphonics last night. Right. So you're really right. There's a particular sound that's coming out of Philadelphia in the 70s, Tom Bell, etc., that is very soulful, that is very mellifluous, lots of falsetto voices that are pleading, baby please, baby please. Yeah. And there's something of that in Barkley's work, not only the dandy street quality, but the kind of empathetic, I meet you halfway, you meet me halfway, kind of ambience. And yes, that's Philadelphia. As Barkley used to say, Philadelphia is like a little town, not too far from that big place up north, and yet it's a place that births him and allows him to do the works that he does.
Really yeah, Richard, your reference to Miles Davis was right on too, because I have gone to many concerts with Miles Davis. In the 80s was when he experimented a lot of fusion music, so to speak. He played with John Scofield, he played with Mike Stern and all kind of people in the 80s. And after all, you're right. He turned his back on you because he wants you to listen to the music. Hello. But of cool. That was it. But of cool. So it's cool jazz, cool painting. So thank you guys so much. I enjoyed it immensely. And thank you again. And back to you, Carolyn.
Great. Thank you, Fong, for that last question. And thank you all so much. So here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm so thrilled to welcome Jaye Elizabeth Elijah here to the Zoom stage. Jaye Elizabeth Elijah is an orb weaver. Their practice connects art and poetry, visual media and the land, teaching and pleasure. Their words and images have appeared in the Counter, Bee Stung, Earth and Color, Journal Safar, the Poetry Project newsletter, among many others. Jaye Elizabeth holds a BA from the New School and is an editor-at-large for Nightboat Books, a freelance language worker, and a forever student. Current subject areas include stars, grief, and disability justice. Born and raised in Southwest Ohio, they now reside under the wide skies of central New Mexico. Thank you so much for being here, Jaye Elizabeth. I'll turn it to you.
I just want to express my deep gratitude for being a part of this celebration and veneration of this powerful show, and for the wisdom and power and of the readings of this work by these speakers. It was a really wonderful discussion. I thought I'd offer a few poems about sense and sensuality, Blackness and its grief, and music. So again, thank you for having me. Birth music, some score. Let us right into the wound, the world, the woods, bird skull, bright sky. We composed ourselves a queer interior, an illegible text, a totem. Make beautiful music, we said inside, and did. We came screaming, breathing hard, and recorded all. We cartwheeled our hips open, burst forth from our center, gave birth to new children, young, breathy, and cartwheeling. Producer produced. Could we be two-headed woman, two-headed snake, magician, magi, something ancient, knowing only something ancient? Could we have written it new, a small-tongued warning? Could we be possible? Could we be bound? Our shed parts taste sonic and special. Whose hand was whose midwife, and whose hand smothered whom? Choking and chirping, turtle egg, bird baby. We came silent, widest eyes, ushered unuttered. And I will share this next poem, which is called Figure. Translucent, dark skin, red undertone, like looking inside the casing at the gore. Another death makes landfall and not TV news. Willful ignorance of sacred geometries. 7th decimal digit, mute point. Denied the infinite space between two heavenly bodies and understood shapes. Late bloomers, short shelf life. Purple, bulbous, tender hesitance. Fig takes 3 years to bear flesh, full fruit. Comes into ripening in the last quiet sun cycle. Slow preparation for the picking. Sexual selection and a future to aspire to. Born again self at the intersection. Reimagining that desire might include them. Easy to bruise and fructescent. If the jam is sweet enough, then the biscuit is best for eating. I was born tomorrow in love and alone, and destined to be dead, having been touched, having once been tender and trashed and subtle sometimes. Something burdensome hangs on the hand, Something babied makes me bold. I done forgot the names of them and my own. I relish the prayer, I handle the holding. It's my work to be willing and unknowable and true, to get kissed and wet. I do not remember what came before this life, but I remember I had one and died then also, let go and lonely, 'cause who could come with but no one and all. I was buried in salt. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Jaye Elizabeth. That was really just beautiful. Thank you, thank you. And thank you, of
Also,
course.
I love the white sweater and the white background. Jay is on it. Beautiful. Reading and awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Amy and Richard and Jason, of course. And we'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. For the past 23 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. Join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a poetry reading curated by Mimi Tempest with Dr. Ayodele Nzinga, Jessica Kamani Hairston, Toya Groves, and Soledad Concarne. And you can now all turn your microphones on and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Rick. And thank you, Amy.
Thank you,
Thank
Amy.
you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So
Thanks,
much.
Amy.
Richard, thanks,
Bye.
Amy.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So special. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Richard.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.